Russia has not shifted an inch. Neither has Zelensky. Neither has Europe, except maybe they've gone a little further away. How do you see that?
Well, I think for Trump, it's a domestic imperative. I mean, he was elected. He was elected on bringing this war to an end. He was the guy who's going to deliver the solution in 24 hours or whatever. But, here we are 7-8 months later. And domestically, I think he's got to be seen to be doing something here, because this situation is really degrading fast. We could say that the rush to get this summit in place is because of the collapse of the Ukrainian front line. That would be probably a big reason why the U.S. would want to somehow, move, because they're looking at the quicker they get to a negotiated settlement. And that's another thing that was established at Alaska, is that there's not going to be any ceasefire. That's a prelude to a negotiated settlement. It's going to be the other way around. And that's just kind of now at least universally accepted. But the quicker they get to that negotiated settlement, that they could freeze the conflict. In other words, the borders, the front lines can be frozen, because that's a big concern, because that really defines how that ends up, is going to define whether Russia can be seen to have won or seen to have been forced into a stalemate, or whatever, however they spin it. But it can't be, from a European and a NATO point of view, or EU point of view, it cannot be seen that Russia has viewed to have won or got everything that they want. And they might be able to spin it, even if they froze it today and gave them the 4 regions and, whatever, they could still spin it as that Russia wanted all of Ukraine. And so that's a win. Or they didn't get to the Dnieper River and we stopped them there. They didn't get Odessa. We've stopped them there. So there's different ways that you can spin this. But the most important thing about this isn't to do with Trump. It's to do with Russia. Because now what Alaska reset the whole power dynamic, and that's that everyone's conforming to the Russian position, you see. So that's the real power
Trump
shift.
Definitely did, for sure, because he was going in with a deadline for an unconditional 30-day ceasefire or bone-crushing sanctions, and that obviously went completely away. He came out of Alaska literally repeating what the Russian side said, which you just mentioned, which was, no, negotiate first, ceasefire second, etc. So he completely went over to that verbally. But then, sorry, go ahead.
Just quickly, what's really important about that is that whether they succeed or fail, that because Russia's participating in this meeting called by Trump, that if it fails, and it probably will fail in the interim, I'm guessing it will, just based on past patterns, that Russia's not going to be blamed. They're making a calculated guess. They have to participate. And if they do, they've been consistent the whole way. So if anything goes wrong, it's not going to be because Russia's changed its position or been flippant or whatever. But Trump has been very erratic. The Europeans have been very erratic. So the international community would more likely, the suspicion or the blame might go on them or Zelensky and not Russia. So that's what's really important about the power shift, is that who would be blamed if it fails.
And going back to your previous point there about the maybe the accelerated timeline because of what they saw happening on the battlefield, that's completely logical and reasonable to want to do that. But then if you're going to do it, and if you're Trump, you're not going to move Russia. You don't have any leverage to compel them to do so. You do have leverage to compel Europe to do something, and Zelensky will do whatever is told, whether he wants to or not, because we have all the leverage on him. But Trump hasn't used any of the leverage that I've seen so far. And in fact, he's allowed them to continue to make the statements that they make, and they're still unmoved. So we're no closer than we were before Anchorage.
No, and if you look at the attack on the pipeline that supplies crude oil, Russian oil via Ukraine, transit through Ukraine to both Hungary and Slovakia, the Druzhba pipeline, the timing of that was clearly staged to undermine or to damage the meeting in Alaska. There's no doubt about that, and the Europeans coming to Washington. So we have a situation still where we have the SBU, who is basically joined at the hip with the CIA and British MI6 and whoever else, and that they're doing things that actively undermine the negotiation or the peace process. So, and as I said, on a couple of other programs of the last couple of weeks, even if even if Putin and Trump draw a contract up in blood, okay, put their fingers on the paper, there's nothing that's going to guarantee that the Europeans or Zelensky and the regime in Kiev are going to abide by it, cooperate with it, or anything. So it's really just between the U.S. and Russia. That's the real problem, actually.
Yeah, and I think we can see a lot of that playing out. And in fact, we saw both the Russian side and the U.S. side both acknowledge that they are looking beyond the war and they are looking to improve relations, et cetera, which we'll actually touch on in a little bit here. But let's turn back to Trump, because here, I think this is a couple of days ago, he was making this comment from the Oval Office in terms of, he was being asked about, where things are. Is Russia going to accept any of the demands that he's making, et cetera? And he kind of went back to, well, here's a good news story. The way he's telling it, we're no longer giving any money to Ukraine.
They request through NATO. We deal with NATO. We don't deal really with Ukraine. NATO requests missiles. They want Patriots. They want missiles. We give the missiles to NATO. NATO pays us in full and does what they want. I mean, I think they give them mostly they can do other things with them too, because we're dealing with NATO. We pay no money to Ukraine. We gave $350 billion to Ukraine.
I never know where this $350 billion figure comes from. I've never seen the math add up to that, but that's I guess neither here nor there. But he seems pretty excited about selling U.S. weapons to NATO for the purpose to then funnel on to Ukraine. What do you make of that?
Well, that allows him to kind of wash his hand of that. That was a big, complaint by the MAGA base, and it was used to kind of rev up this issue early on after inauguration, which is that, why are we wasting all this money on Ukraine? We've got other things to spend the money on. It's not a priority. Zelensky's corrupt, all this stuff. So Trump kind of solves that problem right there and turns it into a little W in terms of, a transactional W for the president there. So, but it's relatively small. It's also problematic as well, because the way that Trump is framing is, we don't have anything to do with what happens with these weapons. The Europeans can do what they want. We're going to sell them the weapons. Well, what happens if some of these weapons are used to hit targets inside Russia, hitting civilians, and Russia decides they're going to escalate there? If it was a direct U.S. responsibility, then at least there's a chain of accountability there that could be parlayed into some emergency diplomatic, communications to de-escalate perhaps, or something like that. But now with this, he's almost delegating it to the Europeans. And if you listen to the Europeans talk, Friedrich Merz, Keir Starmer, they're basically talking up World War III. In the case of Britain, Keir Starmer said, we need to destroy Russia's shadow fleet. He's talking about taking out all Russian tankers in the Baltic Sea and making it hostile for shipping in the Baltic. And I mean, that's World War III talk, basically. So it was always my worry, and I'm not alone, of course, that when the U.S. takes this politically expedient position to say, oh, we're stepping back and the Europeans have to take up the burden of their own collective security, and we want a backseat. America first. We're going to no. There's risks associated with that, and I don't have to tell people what history says over the last 100 years about Europe dragging the United States back into major wars. I mean that's the paradox of this situation. Is yes, the United States is carrying this burden, but do you trust the crazy infighting, tribal, petty rivalries of the elite Europeans? I don't, actually.
Yeah,
and I've a lot of history to back that up.
Not very high on my list of things I'd like to see as well. Fortunately, not all the Europeans are on board with that. And in fact, you mentioned a second ago, Slovakia and Hungary in the Druzhba issue. I'll also hit that in a minute. But one of the things that Viktor Orban said is that even Trump's comments there, not quite the way it appears. When he says we're going to sell it to NATO, and then NATO's going to do whatever they want, Viktor Orban points out that NATO is just a name. It's actually 32 independent countries, and well, there's a bit of a problem.
So who made the deal with President Trump? somebody who has no legitimacy to do so. So it will be never fulfilled, or I don't know who will fulfill that agreement. Then there is a secret chapter of this agreement, if I understand correctly, that's something about Ukraine. And I think this is the most important and most dangerous point. As we are informed, there is a deal that the United States will sell weapons to the Ukrainians in a way that it will be paid by the European Union. But who will pay for that? Because Brussels cannot do so. So again, tariff is one thing, but then there are three other points when the President of the United States made a deal with somebody who has no chance to fulfill that obligation. So I think it will create a lot of difficulties and discourses in the future. Because President Trump will say, why this agreement is not fulfilled? We said, it's not our deal. You made a deal with the President of the Commission. Go there.
So yeah, he's saying I didn't make any deal to buy weapons from Washington D.C. and sell to Ukraine. Robert Fico made nearly the identical argument. I think the day before, he said the same thing, and actually expressly, he said, "We are not going to buy weapons and then hand them over to Ukraine. We're not going to do that." So if those two were saying that, I don't know how many other countries are going to be excited about spending their money to forward something onto Ukraine. I guess some will. What do you think of that?
Well, then they're going to have to, vote among the NATO members of who wants this war more badly than the other members, and that they should pay. But of course, that's not how it works. So Orban's flagged up a basic thing, when Trump speaks of NATO, he's speaking of it like it's an organization with an arms budget. They do have budgets at Brussels, but it's the collective members' military spend that comprises the military force of NATO. So that's a legitimate question. When it's the United States picking up the tab, it's a straight transaction. It's a deal. The United States is supplying the weapons, whether it's lend-lease or they're just giving direct shipments, or in the case Trump was also floating about the piling on more debt onto Ukraine to pay for all this. I mean, there's a certain amount of debt that's probably going to be written off, but there is a significant amount of the aid and even some military aid that technically would have to, go in the liability column for Ukraine. So, but Orban, very canny politician, and he's not going to let that one go. And he's also he and the rest of the Central Asian countries, that's a real opposition bloc within the EU and NATO. They're right on the front line, all those countries. And I think Romania would have been like that if there wasn't meddling in their election by USAID and the US. So, I mean, that's pretty much the whole of, the bordering countries of Ukraine. So what does that tell you? That tells you that everybody who's, furthest away from the conflict in Europe is the most vocal and hawkish. So that's not going to work. So that's very interesting how this is going to play off. There's problems with NATO, and these types of situations, again, when America comes out, you have real problems that could actually affect the integrity of NATO as an organization.
Well, now let's look at it from a slightly different perspective. Let's say that, and I think it's probably a safe assumption that there will be some members of NATO that are going to be willing to pony up some cash and to buy these weapons. But then that exposes another problem, and that is how many weapons do we have to sell? Because when you look at our stockpiles, whether you're talking interceptor missiles, artillery shells, tanks, armored personnel carriers, and more artillery pieces, etc., we're down way past the fat. We're into like the bones in some cases here, and our industrial capacity is nowhere near what the Russian side is. And I'm talking about the West at large. I remember, and I want to say it was December of last year, so before the Biden administration left office, and we played on this show, and I don't remember if you were on that one or not, but we had Jake Sullivan, the national security advisor, was talking about how, the Ukraine side keeps asking for air interceptor missiles, and he said we just don't have them. In fact, the NATO had allegedly 5% of its own needs on the eastern flank in terms of that. We had Marco Rubio in Senate testimony in April said the same thing, that they keep asking us for interceptor missiles, and we don't have it, and we're not going to give any up. So that was in April, and in December of last year. That the production capacity has not increased since then. It's increased since 22, but it hasn't increased since then. Allegedly somewhere around 660 missiles per year. Still significant limitations on the artillery shells beyond what we wanted to do. Can we, if everything is the spigots are open, can the West support Ukraine in basically an endless war?
Well, effectively, the U.S. is, fighting a two-front proxy war with Ukraine and Israel, and who's going to be at the top of the pecking order in terms of first dibs on Patriot missiles and interceptors and all these other essential items? It's going to be Israel. There's no doubt about that. And a lot of what you see in the way these negotiations are going and the arrangements is to give a little bit of breathing room for Israel and for the United States support for Israel. And they're hoping the Europeans are going to be able to kind of patch up and sort of make it work. But it's kind of dangerous, too, because if you remember when the United States was running out of when the Biden's last year, they're running out of certain types of bombs and other things that they had to basically supply cluster bombs, cluster munitions to Ukraine because there was nothing left in stock. So then you have a situation where that was viewed as an escalation by the Russian Federation. That was a red line. Then Russia reciprocates with something else that's seen to be escalatory. And then you could have the same situation here with, let's say, Patriot missile batteries or other interceptor missiles or other munitions where, Germany will, opt to send in its Taurus missiles or something like this in lieu of a lack of supplies from the United States, because there's going to be a backlog. What else does it tell us, Daniel? It tells us that there is going to be a backlog. That means that the supplies are going to be delayed. That means we're talking about a window here of 3 years or something like that, 2 or 3 years. That means that there's people planning to keep this war going for more than a couple years from now.